Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And I'm really honored to introduce our panelists for the Region 3 presentations, beginning with Mr. Patrick Elder. Pat Elder is the Director of Military Poisons, an organization that works to draw attention to the role of the military regarding the environmental contamination it has caused through the use of PFAS in firefighting foams and other applications. He's written 200 articles on PFAS that have been published in several dozen publications, including Global Geneva, Truth Out, Consortium News, Common Dreams, and LA Progressive. Many of his articles may be found on the website www.militarypoisons.org. Pat has been attempting to focus public attention on food, especially seafood, as a primary pathway of human exposure for this suite of chemicals. He argues there's too much focus on drinking water and not enough attention on the unregulated role played by municipal wastewater treatment plants in poisoning surface water in farm fields where sewer sludge is spread. In the absence of EPA regulation, a handful of states have moved to limit several types of PFAS to 20 parts per trillion in drinking water, while fish caught near the burn pits of military bases have been shown to contain over 10 million parts per trillion, and they're not regulated. What's in your fish? Mr. Elder received support from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, U.S. Earth Democracy, Patagonia Foundation, Peace Development Fund, and the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice. Pat is presently working on campaigns in several New England states and Maryland, as well as in Germany and Japan, to influence policymakers to take steps to protect public health from the scourge of PFAS. Pat has toured the US and Europe several times, speaking on contamination at military bases. He has an MA in government from the University of Maryland, as well as a BA in political science education from St. Mary's College of Maryland. So honored to turn it over to you, Mr. Elders.
Thank you so much, Maida. I appreciate it, and I'm honored to address this panel. And you said it, Maida, in your introduction. I think there's too much emphasis on drinking water and not enough emphasis on food. And I think if we look across the pond to the European Food Safety Authority, we'll see a study that says that the vast majority of the PFAS that's in our bodies is derived from food. In fact, they say 86% of the PFAS in us is from food, and the vast majority of that comes from seafood. So I think, our priorities have been a little bit off. And for the last 6 months, I've been attempting to get data from the state of Michigan that has been leading the nation on fish testing. And I finally received that data about 2 weeks ago. They tested 2,894 fish, and the average fish contained 93,000 parts per trillion. So they tested nearly 3,000 fish, and the average fish has more than 90,000 parts per trillion. And they didn't even publish their results until we pried them from them. So in the meantime, the state of Michigan has an MCL of 16 parts per trillion for drinking water. So it's okay to catch fish that often has hundreds and hundreds of thousands of parts per trillion, but don't drink that water if it's more than 16. One fish in Oscoda near Wordsmith Air Force Base, which closed, nearly 30 years ago, was found to contain almost 10 million parts per trillion. So I don't think they've done a very good job in posting do not fish orders, and I don't think they've done a very good job in adding PFAS to fish advisories. I will say that they do say that you shouldn't consume fish with more than 300,000 parts per trillion, but that message hasn't been communicated to the public. So I tested the water where I live in Southern Maryland. I live in St. Mary's City, which is Maryland's colonial capital. It's beautiful here, and it's on the banks of the St. Mary's River. And I live 1,800 feet from the Webster Field Annex of the Patuxent River Naval Air Test Center. And there's a hangar there where they've used PFAS for more than 25 years, and they've also used it in burn pits as well. And so I tested the water using the University of Michigan's biolab, and it had 1,894 parts per trillion, which is astronomical for surface water levels. Doesn't seem like too many people are talking about surface water, but I've learned a little bit about fate and transport. Certainly not an expert, but I live on a cove, and I have learned that the foam, which gathers every other day, I should say, and sometimes can get to a foot and a half high and become airborne. It's a regular occurrence, but it seems to come with the tides, and it's also driven by the wind and the currents. And so it's an interesting study. I published my results in the local press, and immediately an official with the Maryland Department of the Environment was quoted as saying that he questioned the efficacy of the results, and he suggested that rather than the military being the culprit, the PFAS probably came from landfills or the firehouse. The landfill is 11 miles away, and the firehouse, closest one, is 6 miles away. So I seem to think it's probably that airport hangar right across this creek. So I published my results, and 275 residents crowded into a Maryland library after we were able to organize a public meeting with the Navy. Next slide, please. The people at the meeting were worried about the PFAS levels in oysters, crabs, and rockfish. You have to understand Southern Maryland. This is a rich, rich land. The Chesapeake's known as the Great Shellfish Bay. And so people were upset, and they demanded results from the testing performed by the Navy back in 2017. On the left, you can see the foam on my beach, and on the right, you can see a beautiful seafood platter that I will no longer eat. Next slide, please. So let me just read this. Heck, I wanted to at least take a shot at answering some of the questions. The residents said they didn't receive satisfactory answers from the Navy regarding their concerns and questions. Instead, the Navy reiterated 2 points over and over again. The chemicals in question are no longer used, and there's no recommended medical treatment to reduce PFAS in the body. Although residents felt assured that drinking water on base and the water provided by the St. Mary's County MedCom was safe to drink, they expressed concerns about the seafood because of the testing I had done. Several residents asked if the Navy was responsible for elevated cancer rates in the community, and if the federal government could pay for blood testing to ascertain their PFAS levels. The Navy had no answer. Press reports reflected skepticism of many who attended the meeting and demanded a wide array of testing that also includes surface water, seafood, wastewater, sewer sludge, etc. And many were upset by the Navy's position that not enough is known about the potential for adverse health effects to justify remediation. And several said their doctors had never heard of PFAS. Next slide, please. The seafood I tested isn't safe to eat. And this is from my beach, Rockfish, 23,100 parts per trillion. Blue crab, 6,650. Oysters, 2,070. Next slide, please. My daughter, Cassie, who's just beautiful, and she's shown in the backyard overlooking St. Inigo's Creek, where I live on a peninsula with the St. Mary's River. And ever since she was a little girl, she's fished and she's crabbed, she's pulled oysters out of the creek, but today she knows not to eat seafood. Next slide, please. Pax River still has not released results from PFAS testing on base in 2017. So a Navy representative, David Steckler he's the remedial project manager of the Naval Facilities Engineering Command, NAVFAC. He came to the county and he addressed concerns. This is an amazing exchange between Steckler and Matt Morgan. So Steckler basically said, it's a lengthy process. We do the field work, we send the results. It takes 28 days to analyze it. Then we have another 2 weeks and we have data. And the county commissioner, Matt Morgan, came back to him in a distinctively Southern drawl. Well, from the time you collected it and do the data, that's 6 weeks. I'll just, if I did my math correct, we're still looking at 5 years. 6 weeks? I'm just asking questions that the residents in the watermen asked me. So I'm just bringing it up. Next slide, please. Residents in this Navy community are concerned that the foam suppression systems in hangars and firefighting exercises near the shore of the bay have contaminated the water and the aquatic life. At Pax River, they dug 200-foot diameter craters, 3 feet deep. They filled it with jet fuel, and biweekly or monthly, depending upon the time frame, they douse it with aqueous film-forming foam. Next slide, please. You know, folks here are worried about the tendency of PFAS, and in this case, PFOS, to bioaccumulate in fish. From my perspective, PFOS is the most worrisome of all PFAS because of its tendency to bioaccumulate and its mobility in water. So, you know, levels at 1 part per trillion bioaccumulate in fish by several orders of magnitude. So fish near military hangars and burn pits have shown levels of 10 million in states that are limiting the toxins to water to 20 parts per trillion. It just doesn't make sense. Next slide, please. Does this look good? Seafood accounts for 86% of dietary PFA exposure in adults. This has to change the dialogue a little bit. Next slide, please. This is from the current FDA website. Should I stop eating particular foods to reduce my PFAS exposure? Well, they say there's just no scientific evidence that supports avoiding particular foods because of concerns regarding PFAS contamination. That was in October of 2020. I think that's the end of my presentation here. I'd like to thank you again and just try to keep in mind that the fish that we consume, the lobsters up in Boston, the clams, the oysters, what have you, are loaded with this stuff. I thank you.